I wanted to welcome you here. I'm Sheetal Kalantri. I'm a clinical law professor here at the University of Chicago. We've had an excellent discussion here today with Rashida Manjoo, who's the UN Special Rapporteur that we're grateful to have here. We've been discussing the issues of women in prisons, and Rashida is writing a global report about it, which has been informed by some of our discussions here. I wanted to thank all of our co-sponsors, RSVP, who is sponsoring the reception afterwards, Center for Gender and Sexuality Studies, Human Rights Program, and I also want to recognize our Dean Schill, for whom all of this wouldn't have been possible, for welcoming me here and making this event and the Human Rights Clinic a reality at the University of Chicago. So I'm grateful to you for that. And Icon and Zonda, who really organized the whole thing. So it's with great pleasure that I briefly also want to introduce Professor Martha Nussbaum, who will deliver opening remarks and introduce Professor Manjoo. So to introduce her briefly is a Herculean task, so I'm not going to, but other than to say she's the Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics, and she's written, everyone knows her, she's written extensively on multiple topics, including this one, and it's been a real joy and inspiration to me to have her here as a friend and a colleague and someone to learn and work from. So Martha, thank you.
Well, first I want to thank Sheetal for organizing this amazing event, and just to say what a joy it is to have you here with all the creative energy you've brought to the whole issue of human rights. It's a very, very exciting time for us and for all of our students who are lucky to be here at this time. So, it just gives me great pleasure to introduce Rashida Manjoo, who's since 2009 has been Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women under the aegis of the United Nations. She's also on the law faculty at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She's played a prominent part on women's issues in South Africa. So she was, for example, on the Commission on Gender Equality of South Africa, which was a constitutional body mandated to oversee the progress of gender equality issues in the country. She's also been a frequent visitor to the U.S. She's taught at Harvard Law School, at the University of Virginia, and at Webster University. And so we're glad that she's finally come to our campus. I guess I just wanted to say, as someone who's done some work within the UN system, this very baroque and unwieldy bureaucracy, that it's a real challenge to do creative work on human rights issues and especially women's issues within that system. The position that Rashida holds is both extremely important and extremely under-supported, underfunded, and it has to be a labor of love, and yet it's an extremely important position, and it involves dealing with educating the UN bureaucracy about gender issues, which has been a long struggle. It involves also working with governments who have a desire to work with the UN Special Rapporteur on issues of violence against women. But it also involves filtering and winnowing and then responding to at least some of the many individual petitions sent by women from all over the world to the office in Geneva. So it's a very complicated job, and one with the potential for great insight and achievement, but then in the middle of a system which certainly my own experience with the UN is very, very unwieldy and makes actual implementation and change uncertain, as of course do also the many governments in the world. Nonetheless, she's produced reports which have had great importance and is going to do yet more after a recent visit to India. So without further ado, I'll recognize her to talk and then to take your questions. And then around 5 o'clock, I'll just say the discussion is concluded, and we'll adjourn to a reception outside where you can talk with her more informally. But let me just give you our warmest welcome to the University of Chicago.
Thank you so much. Technology. Okay. Thank you so much, Martha, for that warm welcome. It is a bureaucracy, and when I teach, students kind of are starry-eyed about the UN, and I'm constantly having to remind them that the UN is a government of governments, and that self-interest plays a role. Bureaucracy and resistance to change is part and parcel of this institution. But it's the only human rights system that we have globally, and the challenge for independent experts who are part of the system is to try and to make a small dent through our reports, through the complaints that we address, through the work we carry out, including engagements such as these with students, with faculty, with the general public on issues of human rights, and to reinforce that what the UN has produced over its 60-odd years of existence is normative standards that we can use at the national level in our local context to push the boundaries in terms of holding governments accountable, because the accountability is not going to happen at the UN. We're going to wait for the cows to come home before that happens, but we can do accountability through our day-to-day work as citizens in each of our countries. And as I thought about preparing this particular talk, I had come to the United States on an official mission in 2011 and produced a report which is pretty invisible in the US. It was quite a comprehensive report. I had partnered with academics, particularly in the US, to provide me with briefing papers on the different manifestations of violence and some of the issues that I should be engaging the US government with, and I did. And so as I reflected on what I was going to say today, what came to mind is that the global is local. Violence against women is not about the other. It's not about poor black people in the global south. It is here in this community as well, all over the US, the different manifestations. And I see my reports of country missions as accountability tools that citizens should pick up and use to hold their governments accountable. So what I've tried to do is to integrate in my talk some of the findings from my US mission report, hopefully to get some of you to go back and look at the report and think about how you can use that as an accountability mechanism in engaging with your own government here. But these are global challenges that we face, that I have seen in the 3.5 years, and my mandate is almost 20 years old. So my predecessors have also seen the linkages, the continuum, and the prevalence rates and the manifestations might be different, but these are global issues. So to start with, I do want to thank the Human Rights Program, the International Human Rights Clinic at the University of Chicago, as well as the other co-organizers. And hello to the Dean, who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting. Thank you very much for having a very supportive human rights program. This is not the norm all over the world, and I commend this law school for that. This morning and this afternoon, we had some amazing discussions with many experts from within the US as well as from other parts of the world on the issue of violence against women in custodial settings. And I would like now, many of you were part of some of those discussions, but I want to talk a little bit away from custodial violence to looking broadly at what the mandate does and how it looks at violence against women, the findings over the years, etc. And yes, India is on our mind, Egypt is on our mind, Tunisia is on our mind, the so-called Arab Spring, which I call the Arab Winter. Spring is about new life. It isn't about death and the death of democracy, the death of existing systems, etc. So just to focus a little bit on what the mandate over the 20 years existence has done. So on a very practical level, part of my tasks are to conduct thematic research and to produce 2 thematic reports a year, one for the Human Rights Council in Geneva, one for the General Assembly in New York, to conduct official missions to a wide range of countries. I cannot go into a country unless I have an invitation from the government. I do not wait for an invitation. I send a request. And the governments that are responsive invite you very quickly, and others don't respond, but silence is not acquiescence, which means I still cannot go into those countries. There's a list of countries that I haven't been able to go to because the governments have not responded. I also receive individual allegations from victims from around the world and different violations that have occurred, and my engagement at that level is with the governments of that country, reminding them of their international law obligations, which they've undertaken voluntarily, and asking the questions in relation to the allegations and their obligations to that citizen in terms of redress measures, in terms of their responses and preventative measures. I mentioned this morning that the response rate on those allegation letters that we sent, the communications we sent to governments, is pretty low. It's 25% to a third. But the value of the allegation system of receiving these complaints is that the person who sends us the complaint does not have to exhaust her domestic remedies, which can be a pretty onerous task, to exhaust your domestic remedies before you can take your complaint to an international forum. With the system of special procedures that I'm in, you do not have to exhaust your domestic remedies. You can send the complaint directly to one of the mandate holders, either a geographic or a thematic mandate holder. The second thing is that the country against whom that complaint is being lodged does not have to be a party to any international law instrument. And those are two huge advantages that are kind of relatively unknown, and so the special procedures system doesn't get used for individual complaints. But that's one of the other tasks that I carry out. Now, the mandate looks at violence through both a spatial and a temporal lens. As regards the spatial, I look at violence in four spheres: in the home, in the community, violence that is perpetrated or condoned by the state. And when you think about institutions, detention centers, refugee camps, psychiatric hospitals, prisons, police detention, this is where either the violation of human rights takes place directly by state agents or through condoning, through a failure to protect, a failure to prevent. So that's the third sphere of violence that I look at. And I also look at violence against women at the transnational level, the issues of refugees, migrants, displaced people, etc. In terms of time, I look at violence against women in times of so-called peace, in times of conflict, post-conflict, displacement, transitions, etc. Almost every government in the world, including very recently in March of this year at the Commission on the Status of Women in New York, where the focus was violence against women, almost every government acknowledged that violence against women is the most pervasive human rights violation that we face today, whether it's in times of peace or conflict. So there is a huge media focus on sexual violence in conflict or during times of transition. But there's an acknowledgement that violence against women is the most pervasive human rights violation we face globally, and that interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence, is actually the worst form of violation that we face in terms of violence against women. So the sphere of the home, I look at intimate partner violence, interpersonal violence, which we sometimes call domestic violence, but I think that hides the true nature of spousal violence, partner violence, etc. But my mandate doesn't specifically cover the girl child, but one cannot ignore the reality of the lives of girl children in many parts of the world. So I also look at violence against the girl child, from child abuse of all forms in the home setting to the issue of incest, which is a growing problem in many parts of the world. Harmful and degrading practices in the name of culture, religion, tradition is something that I also look at as a sphere of violence within the home, within the private spaces, or the so-called private spaces. In many societies, one of my findings is that domestic violence in particular continues to be perceived as normal, as socially acceptable and legitimate. And of course, it remains extremely underreported for many reasons, which many of you would know. Victims hesitate to report out of fear of retaliation, family or community pressure not to reveal domestic problems, poor awareness of rights, lack of support services, economic dependency, or perceptions that the criminal justice system, including the police as the first port of call, will not be responsive to the issue. During my mission to the US in 2011, I learned that minority and immigrant communities are even more reluctant to reach out to the authorities, as they view the police and the courts as oppressive rather than protective institutions. During interviews with survivors and advocates, I heard accounts of disproportionate arrests of women of color following incidents of intimate partner violence. It was argued that the stereotypes about African American women as being more aggressive is leading to police officers not adequately differentiating between victims and primary aggressors when intervening in domestic violence cases. I see someone applauding out there. And closely tied to domestic violence, practices that are harmful, as I mentioned, and are justified in the name of culture, religion, tradition, is a global issue, and it continues without systematic monitoring or punishment, despite, funnily enough, increasing legislative developments to outlaw, to prohibit such practices. But the practices continue. In some countries, earlier forced marriages, polygamy, unregistered marriages continue to be of concern. And these practices are aggravating factors which increase the vulnerability of women to violence. The manifestation of violence against women in the community includes numerous types of sexual offenses, sexual crimes including rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, violence within institutions. I see a growing problem of sexual violence in schools, tertiary institutions as well, where I've discovered in South Africa that at the university level there are internal disciplinary measures that are dealing with sexual violence cases. And the victims are not being referred to the police, and the student is excluded, and the victim is given some sort of counseling, and then you ask, so where's accountability in these institutions? So that's something that I have been following up on. The issue of trafficking, forced prostitution, forced pornography are also common manifestations of violence that we find at the community level. Sexual violence is widespread. It's not, I know the June 16th incident in India kind of raised the media profile both in the country and outside. I just finished a mission to India a few days ago, and one of the concerns in India was that sexual violence happens all over. Why is there such a global focus on what is happening in India? And you know, it's a simple answer. For the first time, the silence had been broken, that the act on the 16th of December was so horrific that people could not keep quiet, that this was a pervasive problem, and this had led to the death of a young woman. It was a gang rape, etc. It was at the, you know, one doesn't want to create hierarchies, but the silence had been broken, and during the mission, I would sort of get 3 different newspapers, and almost every newspaper had 5 reportings from young girls to women who'd been, and so the silence in a sense has been broken. There is a focus, but I think that the media also needs to kind of look very clearly that this is not about India or Egypt or whatever. This is a global problem. The silence has been broken in India through this horrific incident. Young people are getting involved, and you know, I had some conversations with young people, with parents asking what's different about the activism around this, and one of the responses was, for parents there's a fear it could have been my child. For young people it's a fear of young men trying to put themselves in a position where they were helpless to help the friend that was being raped and that was killed, and for young women it could be me. So the issue of security, the issue of public spaces that are insecure has led to younger people, older people getting involved, but keeping the issue alive in a way that I think the starting point is unfortunate, but I think the good thing is that people are talking about this, about sexual violence in India in the way that they are. The issue in the United States, one of my findings is that rape and sexual assault are prevalent forms of violence, and I think your 2009 crime victimization survey states that approximately 500 women a day are subjected to sexual assaults here in the US. And that's a lot of young women and older women. I also received numerous reports during that mission on the prevalence of sexual assault against Native American women and how violence against them exceeds that of any other population group in the country. It was reported to me that 34% of Indian and Alaskan Native women will be raped in their lifetimes. And I think we can see linkages of poverty, exclusion, historical exclusion of Native Americans, and how that feeds into the dynamic of high prevalence rates. I also, having gone to a reservation here during my mission, discovered that Caucasian men that were committing crimes on reservations could not be prosecuted in the tribal courts on the reservations. They had to be prosecuted by the state courts, and the state courts were not really keen to prosecute Caucasian men who were violating Native American women on the reservations. And I believe there has been a change in that post the mission. I'm not going to take credit that was part of the recommendations that I made to the US government. The other manifestation that I have seen globally is an increase in the rise of incidents of stalking. And this is a crime that targets women at a higher rate than men and has links to other violent crimes such as battering, rape, and murder. One of the statistics that was given to me is that women in the US are at higher risk of stalking than men, with 20 victimizations per 1,000 females as compared to 7 victimizations per 1,000 males. With regard to gender-related killings of women, last year I presented a report to the UN Human Rights Council which analyzed specific manifestations of this phenomena, including the killing of women as a result of intimate partner violence, which is a growing problem all over the world. The figures in Italy and Spain are quite horrific. I was conducting a mission in 2011 to Jordan, and I had numerous people saying, Jordan, honor killings. And I go to Jordan, and the prevalence rate of so-called honor killings was between 10 and 15 a year. I then conducted a mission to Italy, and 151 women had been killed in 1 year by an intimate partner in Italy. Spain, the figures are pretty high as well, and they're growing in many European countries. So this phenomena of killing intimate partners is not about honor crimes, etc. The other manifestation I looked at is killings of women due to accusations of sorcery and witchcraft. You would think we were living in the Dark Ages. In Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, women are being killed in large numbers because they're being accused of being witches. I heard about this in India as well. Part of it has to do with the fact that this is about property grabbing. It's about dispossessing women of any property that they own by making accusations that these are witches, so that it legitimizes the killings of these women. Killings of women in the name of honor. My missions to Algeria, to Jordan have highlighted this. Killings in the context of armed conflict. My mission to Somalia highlighted this. My mission to El Salvador as well. Killings of indigenous women in particularly Central Latin American country. Extreme forms of violent killings of women, such as those that are related to gangs, to organized crime, to drug dealers, and human and drug trafficking, which I found really horrendous, particularly during my El Salvador mission. Killings as a result of sexual orientation and gender identity is another form of killing that I have picked up. Zimbabwe, South Africa, and other parts of the world where we've had 2 lesbians killed in the last 18 months, I think, in South Africa, and it's based on killings based on their sexual orientation. And then other forms of gender-related killings, such as female infanticide, which we see. And in my report, I argue to the Human Rights Council that rather than a new form of violence, gender-related killings are the extreme manifestation of existing forms of violence against women. And we have to acknowledge that such killings are not isolated incidents which arise suddenly and unexpectedly. So in Italy, they talk about crimes of passion. But these killings are not, they don't arise suddenly, but they're the ultimate act of violence in a continuum of violence. And that's the message. When governments do not deal adequately with violence against women, when it first occurs in any form or manifestation, whether it's verbal, psychological, physical, the ultimate act of violence is the death of a woman in this continuum of violence. Of course, the lack of accountability, impunity is the norm rather than accountability being the norm in such cases. The lack of disaggregated data, so everything becomes a murder as opposed to a gender-related killing of a person, and looking at what are the systemic aspects, addressing the issues that underpin the killings of women, does not then become part of the remedy that governments have in terms of their due diligence obligations. In the third sphere of violence that I look at, not all violence, of course, is committed by private actors, but is also perpetrated or condoned by the state. And this is particularly the case, as we discussed all day today, in custodial settings, whether it's psychiatric hospitals, detention centers, etc. During times of conflict and post-conflict situations, we also see violence perpetrated or condoned by the state. And this often exacerbates an existing environment of discrimination, subordination, and men's control over women, particularly as regards their sexuality. So when you think about, the DRC, etc., it very clearly, women's bodies as sites of war, as weapons of war being waged, is something that we see in different parts of the world. In custodial settings, whether it's in police custody or immigration detentions or in detention or prisons, it's a common manifestation of state-perpetrated or condoned violence. And torture, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment, including for rapes and other forms of sexual violence, are part and parcel of the manifestations that we see. Threats of rape, touching, virginity testing, being stripped naked, invasive body searches, insults and humiliations of a sexual nature are part of this pattern of the abuse of power in custodial settings. As we discussed earlier today as well, for some of you who were there, that women are particularly at risk of being incarcerated. They're much poorer, they're unable to pay to have money for bail, to pay for petty fines, and so incarceration becomes a pattern, which then the continuum of violence continues in the custodial setting. Another finding of some of the research that we've been engaged is that a high proportion of women offenders have experienced violence or sexual abuse prior to their incarceration, and so you see the continuum again. During my mission to the US, I was informed about some of the root causes of women's incarceration, including where gender intersects with poverty and race. Again, something that was confirmed in discussions all day. These factors of poverty and race results in African American and Hispanic women facing disproportionate levels of criminalization, more severe sentencing, overrepresentation in prisons, and abuse. It is also argued that the possible causes for racial disparity are complex and varied, but factors such as criminal laws with mandatory sentencing provisions have had a disparate impact on certain racial groups in the US. In the US, I also looked at the military as an institution where violence against women occurs. And military environments in general are characterized by a hierarchy, a command-driven culture, which exposes women to heightened risks of violence and abuse. I looked at the phenomena of sexual violence within the military and the risks faced by women who join the military. This includes facing physical and emotional risks associated with war and combat, but also of suffering assault at the hands of their peers. One woman that I interviewed about 40 women, and each one had been sexually assaulted, and each one had left the military, and none of them were satisfied. There hadn't been any accountability, and she described what had happened to her as similar to incest, that you are serving with your brother, and you expect your brother to have your back, and you are violated by someone who should have your back, who you see in this role as your brother. And then you have to report to whoever's in charge, the commander of the base, etc., who you consider a father figure that you should be able to go to reveal the abuse. And decisions are made at that level of who is more valuable, the perpetrator or the victim, who does the military want to retain. And so she discussed, described it as a situation of incest, being in the military and being violated in this way. The factors from the hierarchy to command-driven structures to a culture that promotes masculine traits of power and control creates this pattern of underreporting, of impunity as the norm. The survivors that I spoke to explained how the perpetrators often exert control over the victims, are likely to outrank them. If the perpetrator falls within the victim's chain of command, reporting the incident can be almost impossible. They feel that they need to make a choice between their military career and seeking justice. Other reporting barriers include the lack of confidentiality, the fear of punishment for collateral misconduct, and I think there are studies which show that. There are many charges brought against a victim who is revealing sexual violence incidents. Fear of retaliation by perpetrators because commanders reportedly often fail to protect those who report sexual assault. And I think just in the last week, I saw an email that speaks about a new report on sexual violence in the military here. And my hope is that now that there is more visibility, that there would be more action in terms of accountability. Across boundaries in the transnational sphere, of course, the manifestations of violence that I referred to above, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's in the community, sexual offenses, etc., women face additional risks and vulnerabilities. Women victims of trafficking and other forms of contemporary forms of slavery, refugee women, women migrant workers, especially irregular migrant workers, face different forms of exploitation and abuse. And my US report also refers to that. Armed conflict, of course, also increases the risk of women and girls being abducted and forced into sexual slavery and or forced prostitution. During conflict, women are often trafficked across borders to provide sexual services to combatants. Most conflicts now are internal, as we know, but women and girls may be transported across international borders to camps of armed groups located in the territory of a neighboring country. I think we saw that with the DRC in Uganda and those porous borders where girls and women were being transported across these borders. Rape, early marriages, survival sex continues to be a major problem affecting women asylum seekers and refugees, both in camps that I visited as well as women residing in urban areas. 2 years ago, I produced a report for the Human Rights Council as part of my thematic report on multiple forms of discrimination and the structural causes of violence against women. And all the manifestations that I mentioned above are rooted in multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and inequalities faced by women. And they often link to the social and economic situation and a reflection and a reinforcement of the discrimination, inequality, and oppression to which many women are subjected in both public and private spaces. Violence does violate the equality and non-discrimination rights of women and girls in ways that are contingent upon, amongst others, on women's material conditions, on their individual attributes and social locations. So when I talk about their material reality, I look at issues of educational attainment, housing, access to land, to food, to water, to work, which all play a role in how and to what extent women will experience violence. Not only does violence disproportionately target the most vulnerable women in society, but the conditions under which they live can also position them as being especially vulnerable to gender-based violence. Individual aspects of women's bodily attributes such as skin color, race, intellectual and physical abilities, age, language skills, ethnic identity, sexual orientation further contributes to risk factors for violence. Social location, when I talk about social locations, I refer to the different positions occupied by individual women that give rise to both intergender and intragender differences and discrimination. Factors such as geographic location, level of education, employment situation, household size, marital relationships, and access to political and civic participation all impact women's vulnerability to violence. Interpersonal violence cannot be fully understood without considering the institutional and structural forms of violence against women. And this, as we know, is reflected in laws, in policies and practices that maintain one group's advantage over another in places of employment, in terms of educational opportunities, access to resources, protection by the police and other state authorities, and to services and benefits. Interpersonal, institutional, and structural forms of violence perpetuate gender inequalities, but also racial inequalities, racial hierarchies, religious orthodoxies, ethnic group exclusionary practices, and resource allocation that benefits some groups of women at the expense of others. Some of the challenges that I've identified over the years in my mandate over the last 19 years, some of the challenges are the pervasiveness of patriarchal attitudes in law enforcement and justice systems, coupled with a lack of resources, insufficient knowledge, lack of responsiveness about existing applicable law, legislation, leads to inadequate responses to cases of violence against women and persisting social acceptance of such acts because, as I mentioned, impunity is the norm and not accountability. Low levels of prosecution for crimes against women reinforce the belief among victims that there is no systematic and guaranteed response, criminal justice response to violence, and that there might be no punishment for their abusers. I've also studied the measures that governments have undertaken to date to address the phenomena, and the sort of three large responses have been legislative measures, and here the governments have, many governments have ratified international human rights instruments. They've harmonized national legislation with the international norms and standards. They've adopted specific legislation on violence against women. A second level of engagement by states is at the institutional and policy level. The introduction of specialized mechanisms to investigate and prosecute violence against women, provide support and other services, enhance cooperation and information sharing between authorities and service providers. A third level is awareness raising and capacity building activities, including gender training for state officials, campaigns like the 16 Days of Activism, etc., are part of what governments do. However, despite these efforts, violence remains a pervasive and widespread phenomenon, and no single country in the world can claim that there is progressive elimination occurring. In fact, civil society in general, and women's rights activists in particular, argue that the problem is increasing and is reaching epidemic proportions, and that if this was a medical disease, a state of emergency would have been declared globally. And yet governments feel that they're doing a lot. I've just finished a report for the 2013 report to the Human Rights Council, where I look at this issue of state responsibility to act with due diligence to eliminate violence against women. And it's what I've just mentioned. It's that no government in the world, everyone's doing something, but whether it's substantive, whether it's sustainable, and whether it's coherent is the challenge. And I think this report is probably going to get me a lot of attacks during the interactive dialogue, but that's the reality, that we don't have a cohesive, sustainable response by any government in the world to dealing with violence against women. I have repeatedly voiced my view that failure in response and prevention measures stems from the government's inability and or unwillingness to acknowledge and address the core structural causes of violence against women. We have to make linkages between violence against women and other systems of oppression that are prevalent within all societies. A legislative and policy approach will not bring about substantive change if it's not implemented within a holistic approach that simultaneously targets the empowerment of women, social transformation, and the provision of remedies that ultimately break the continuum of discrimination and violence that women experience. The multiplicity of forms of violence against women, as well as the fact that the violence frequently occurs at the intersection of different types of discrimination, makes it necessary for governments to adopt multifaceted strategies within a holistic approach. The holistic approach would consider each woman's social location and bodily integrity to better understand the scope of vulnerability, the risk, and the consequences of violence, whether interpersonal or structural or both. As a starting point for intervention and the provision of remedies, a holistic approach makes clear that gender inequality and gender stratification are but two of the many factors that perpetuate and promote violence against women in all parts of the world. And such an approach then counters efforts that focus on violence against women as solely as a women's issue, or a welfare issue, or a social issue, as opposed to a human rights issue. And it's an approach that risks minimizing the role that socioeconomic, cultural, religious, racial, ethnic, ability, education, sexual orientation, all these other isms that we are aware of that exist in societies, access to citizenship, to resources, etc., all play a role in this continuum of violence. And as long as governments refuse to acknowledge that structural, systemic, institutional factors lie at the heart of the continuum of violence, then the remedies are band-aid solutions that are being proposed. I argue in that report that a holistic approach requires treating rights, human rights, as universal, interdependent, and indivisible. So looking at civil and political, economic, social, cultural development rights as part of the core that needs to be taken into account when considering remedies. The second aspect of a holistic approach would be situating violence in a continuum that spans interpersonal and structural violence and acknowledges that violence against women is not the root problem, but that it occurs because other forms of discrimination have been allowed to flourish. The third aspect is accounting for both individual and structural discrimination and considering not only how individual lives are affected by the immediate impact of abuse, but how structures of discrimination and inequality perpetuate and exacerbate gender, racial, and other inequalities. And fourthly, analyzing not only the social and/or economic hierarchies between women and men, the intergender, but also among women, the intragender, to identify how discrimination affects women in different ways depending on how they're positioned within social, economic, and cultural hierarchies, and incorporating this into anti-violence efforts. My argument in that report to member states is that violence against women cannot be resolved with a one-size-fits-all programmatic approach. Women are not homogeneous, whether in a country, within a locality, etc. Women are different. And so the one-size-fits-all programmatic approach will not work. And that combating violence requires multiple approaches for its elimination. It requires systematically adopting a twin-track approach of both gender mainstreaming and women-focused specificity, which takes into account women's inter- and intragender equality and non-discrimination rights, and also the right to be free from all forms of violence, both public and private. This is something that I have seen more. The South African Constitution has a provision in the Bill of Rights section clearly articulating the right of every citizen to be free from all forms of violence, both public and private. And this is I've seen in other constitutions, newer constitution, that it's being included. I think the international law system doesn't have this, but I think that guarantee, we talk about the right to a life of dignity, but what is a right to a life of dignity? We need to start articulating more. The right to a life free of all forms of violence is part and parcel of the rights that all human beings should have, and both public and private violence. Multiple approaches require adequate human and material resources in order to assess and monitor how laws, policies, and institutions impact violence and discrimination, including in the areas of redress and compensation to victims. This is again something that in this 2013 report that I've picked up, is that governments do create systems, programs, laws, policies, etc., But the weakness is there aren't monitoring and evaluation policies. And even if we started talking in the sort of cost-benefit analysis terms, which I really dislike, but even if we started talking in those terms of cost-benefit, you would think it's to the advantage of countries, of governments, to know, to monitor, to evaluate whether their programs, their laws, their policies are working and where are the structural deficiencies. But building in monitoring and evaluation is not part and parcel of programmatic work, as I discovered when I was doing my research for this report. Determining how best to protect, promote, and fulfill women's rights to non-discrimination, equality, and freedom from violence also requires states to respect their international law commitments, including the obligation to act with due diligence to prevent, to protect, and provide compensation to women victims of violence, as well as to hold perpetrators of such violence responsible for their actions. Thank you very much, and I open the floor for questions. I have one fan in the room.
Thank you so much for your report. And words, I really want to understand if things aren't getting better, but there is a growing awareness. This has come on the agenda of so many international organizations. There's so many more non-governmental organizations getting involved. There's so much more research. How do you see that, if at all, contributing to the amelioration of this problem?
I conducted some consultations in preparations for my report, my 2013 report on state responsibility. I was trying to understand through a memo that I sent to member states asking, how do you understand and fulfill your due diligence obligation to eliminate violence against women? And I asked the same of the civil society consultations that I had. How does your government, first of all, understand, interpret, and implement the due diligence obligations? And there's a sense of frustration that passing more laws, creating more policies, in isolation of dealing with the harder structural issues, has meant that violence against women is increasing and that the remedies are not meeting the problem. And so the frustration at the level of the civil society is, yes, there's more awareness. But more awareness is not leading to even a reduction in many societies. In fact, most of the consultations, I held one for the Pacific Islands in Fiji, one for the former Balkan countries in Slovakia, one for the Middle East, North African region in Tunis, and attended 2 African consultations. The overall view from civil society is that the prevalence rates are growing, elimination is a dream, there is more awareness, there's more law reform, but with law reform hasn't come more monitoring and evaluation and holding accountable state actors that fail in their obligations to protect, to prevent, and to punish. So, so the awareness is not leading to progressive declining of prevalence rates. And that, in fact, the prevalence rates are growing, and now the new excuse in parts of the world is that it's about the economic crisis. So men are frustrated and they come home and they beat up their partners and their wives, etc., which is a nonsensical issue because they don't beat up people in the workplace or on the street, etc. They come and do it in their homes. So, and I think there's 2 things going on. One is finding excuses why the prevalence rates are going up, but not examining that the responses are not adequately addressing the structural root causes of violence against women. The one other response that is going on by governments and donor countries in particular is pumping more money into men and boys programs. And there is no success story when it comes to the issue of men and boys programs. They're not evaluating this program, but putting a lot of money. And the concern of women's rights activists, in particular working on violence against women, is that we haven't finished the work of empowerment of women, we haven't finished the work of accountability and redress, and the focus has shifted, and it's another perpetuation of the patriarchy and privileging men and boys now instead of dealing with the root causes of violence against women, which go to the heart of inequality, of discrimination, the structural and institutional aspects of the lives of women.
I had a question about some specific policy. What do you think has been your biggest success during your time with the UN in terms of specific advocacy and policy? And how do you measure, you talked about like the sustainability and the how substantial a policy is. How do you measure that?
As Martha said, the UN is an animal in a different form that I don't think of success stories. I think every little bit counts of making public and making visible and breaking the silences. So through my country missions, I'm able to articulate the reality of a very small slice of what I see and hear in the 10 days or 2 weeks that I'm in a country, and make recommendations. And there are countries where civil society and the academic sector is proactive about using the report as an accountability tool to do the advocacy work at the national level, to hold the government accountable because they have a report that allows them to now, in a very concise way, address it. So I don't think of success story. I think, after I've written a recommendation in a country mission report and a government comes to me and says, can we talk about this recommendation? Why are you asking for more specificity in legislation and policy? And we have a discussion. And then 6 months later, I hear that they're possibly going to have a law on domestic violence. And I think, yay, But that's about it in terms of feeling that you're making a dent. But in the absence of not doing this kind of work, we're not going to be able to push the boundaries, because there are still countries in the world and there's still people in the world that you say violence against women and they equate that to domestic violence. And that's it. They don't think of violence against women through an institutional, through a structural, through a systemic lens. And that linking violence against women as a cause and a consequence of inequality, of discrimination, of oppression is that lens. And so constantly pushing that. I think for this mandate in particular, we've taken the resolution that created the mandate, and I'm the third mandate holder, and we've just continued to push the boundaries on it where we get attacked. I mean, I get attacked every time I include references in my report on sexual orientation and gender identity issues, but we continue to push these boundaries for governments to understand that these are grounds of discrimination and inequality, and that as long as you don't address root causes, you're not going to be able to eliminate what is a pervasive systemic problem. I know Martha's going to stop us soon. Okay, two more. So we have two.
So you cited how, especially in India and Egypt, the media has played a crucial role in highlighting this issue. How do you balance the stigma that's attached to rape and sexual violence for women, and how hard it is for women to come forward and admit that they're victims of these crimes, with trying to get media coverage for these crimes? And how can you encourage women to come forward when sometimes admitting that they're a victim of these crimes places them in more danger?
Thank you. I think the role of the media, particularly as we saw it in India and Egypt, was one that allowed a society to acknowledge that this happens in our country as well. So in Egypt, with the virginity testing of the protesters, that became a huge issue. It was out in the media. Many mandates addressed letters to the Egyptian government. I think at a certain point, when a society starts looking and reflecting on these manifestations, it's one other way of lessening the stigma, because the stigma will continue and gets perpetuated, and silence helps that. But if you can de-stigmatize it through verbalizing that this is a human rights violation that's occurring, that citizens are the ones that are being violated by state agents or private actors, I think you can address stigma as long as you don't break the silences. The issue of safety of victims who disclose, I didn't hear about any kind of backlash in India against people who had started reporting. I mean, I think, it also depends on, I'm not sure what, and maybe there are more experts in the room on India than I am. I'm not an expert after a 10-day mission. But I think in India, my sense was that overall, yes, there were the sensationalized media coverage. There was that going on. But there was also a more nuanced coverage going on. And people who should be consulted about their views were being consulted, writing opinion pieces, etc. So demystifying that there's nothing special about what has happened here, this is horrific, and it forces reflection within the society, and I think the media is helpful there. I didn't hear about any kind of backlash against people that were reporting. In Egypt, I think human rights defenders have been challenged, they've been demonized by state agencies, media state agencies, around their disclosures of what had gone on in detention. But I think they've continued to speak out, and that's part of it. And different societies have done it at different stages to speak out. I mean, when I think of South Africa, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to deal with the atrocities of the past. But the women would not come forward to talk about the kind of violations that they had experienced at the interpersonal level. Women were coming, almost 50% of testifiers at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were women who came to talk about what had happened to their husbands, their brothers, their sons. But they were not talking about what the system of apartheid had done to them, the kind of violations that they had experienced, sexual, physical, psychological, at the hands of state agents. And the TRC had to be educated that unless you create an enabling environment and a responsive environment, women will not come forward to speak. And so the TRC held 3 women-only hearings to kind of get the silence broken, to get women to talk about, during apartheid days, what had gone on and the violations they'd experienced. And even then, very few women came forward. And partly it had to do with the issue of stigmatization. Was this the right place to break the silence, to talk? But I think for societies where the silence is broken, there's no going back, in a sense, and I think it's harder for the backlash, it's harder to continue demonizing women who are breaking the silences by sort of the government-driven media, because the mainstream media is reporting. Of course, there's always going to be the sensationalization. I mean, when I finished I had a press conference at the end of the mission, and the big sort of media journalists who were in the room want the soundbite. And my attitude is, you have a 7-page document, a press statement, read it and use it. Because the sound bites are not helpful to anyone. Comparing countries is not helpful to anyone, because one violation is one violation too many. So, so I think that once you break the silence, it's hard to kind of get people to be silenced again about the violations that they experience. And you give permission to people to speak. We had one there.
If you could talk a little bit more about the honor killings that you've seen in your missions. Are they related more to cultural, religious, or gender inequality, or all 3?
I think the honor killings, for me, what I saw in Jordan or heard about in Algeria, I think there is a perception in the global north that this is a hugely pervasive problem. And so in some ways it was very fortunate that I conducted the mission to Jordan and to Italy in the same year, because suddenly I could see, we're talking about 15 women in one country and we're talking about 152 women in another country. And so the labeling of this, in Italy they talk about crimes of passion, but it is, the killing of a woman is because some man feels dishonored, because she's made a decision to leave him, she's having an affair or whatever it is. He feels dishonored. So using a different terminology doesn't detract from the fact that a woman got killed in Italy or a woman got killed in Jordan because some man felt dishonored by this. So I think that we can use, I didn't hear religion being used, but I think the cultural practices of families feeling dishonored and disrespected comes through in some of these killings.
Okay, now we're going to adjourn to more informal discussion outside at the reception. But first, to thank Rashida very, very warmly for a terrific talk. That was really good.